Before we begin today's episode, just a reminder to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell if you enjoy this episode. On a cool fall afternoon, 28-year-old Bonneville Power Administration employee Julie Weflen was sent out to an isolated substation to correct an issue with a transformer. Hours later, a local noticed that while Julie's work van was still there, she was nowhere to be found. Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene and discovered skid marks, tire tracks, and clear indications that a struggle had taken place. Left behind at the scene was Julie's purse, hard hat, and a few personal effects scattered around the van. It was clear from the get-go that they were dealing with an abduction. A massive search and media campaign was launched in hopes of finding Julie, but over the years there was a single person of interest who captured investigators' attention, not just because of the proximity of his house to the site where Julie vanished, but because of his association with an unrelated missing person. This is Trace Evidence, episode 126, The Disappearance of Julie Weflen. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the truly baffling disappearance of Julie Weflen. Before getting into the case, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. You can follow the show on social media on Twitter at TraceEvPod, Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, or by searching Facebook for Trace Evidence. The show is also available on MeWe and Minds. If you're interested in supporting the show and getting some Trace Evidence merch, there's a Patreon available at patreon.com/traceevidence, or you can donate via PayPal. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions directly through the website or email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Julie Weflen disappeared while doing routine maintenance for her job. More than 30 years later, and the mystery surrounding her disappearance still endures. This is episode 126, The Disappearance of Julie Weflen. It was a cool afternoon in September of 1987 when 28-year-old Julie Weflen strode out of BPA, Bonneville Power Administration's Hawthorne Road office in North Spokane. Julie worked as an operator for the company, and her duties included energizing and de-energizing power equipment, reading meters, and maintaining transformers. When Julie wasn't at her desk catching up on paperwork, she was out in the field maintaining substations and working on power lines, among other responsibilities. It wasn't long after lunch, sometime between 1 and 2 p.m., when Julie was notified of an issue at a nearby station. Reportedly, one of the transformers at the Spring Hill substation, approximately 20 miles to the northwest, was running low on nitrogen, and Julie made preparations to head out to the secluded location and get everything back to normal. One of Julie's co-workers apparently commented to her that it wasn't an emergency and she could leave it till the next day, but Julie had time and wanted to get it out of the way. Climbing into her BPA-issued minivan, Julie began the 30-minute drive which would take her through downtown Spokane, then west through the greenery of Riverside State Park. Shortly after exiting the area of the park, West 7 Mile Road met with Cooley Height Road, where it transitioned into 4 Mound Road. A few hundred yards up that road stood the unmanned Spring Hill substation. Julie turned the minivan, parking in the station's gravel parking lot. Official company records indicate that Julie logged into the substation at 2 p.m., but she never returned. Instead, she would mysteriously vanish from the isolated location, kicking off an investigation which has stretched on now for more than 30 years. Julie Ann Weflen was born on May 3, 1959, to parents Robert and Bette Miner. Julie grew up in the area of Portland, Oregon, attending Beaumont Grade School and Grant High School. As a youngster, Julie loved animals, specifically horses, and she dreamed of growing up to race them, but an issue with her spine would put an end to that dream. According to the Spokesman Review, when Julie was 14 years old, it was discovered that she had a badly curved spine, and in an attempt to correct that issue, she had to wear a full-body corrective cast for 6 months. While her friends were out enjoying life and picking up the newest fashions, Julie was living in a situation where for half a year she could only stand up straight or lie down, with the turning of her head being her only free movement. However, while some might have taken it hard, Julie found a way to smile through it. Her mother, Bet, later told reporters that she had to lay Julie down on the kitchen counter and wash her hair under the sink during that time, but Julie refused to allow this to keep her down. She explained, quote, "Julie never stopped smiling. For 6 months, the only thing Julie could move was her head, but she was strong then, and it's something that made her the strong person she is now." End quote. After 6 months, Julie was free of the cast, but a metal rod was permanently implanted in her spine to help fix the condition. While her horse racing dreams were gone, Julie still indulged in her love of animals, and for a time there was consideration of her going into a field where she'd be able to work with them, maybe a veterinarian, but her life would ultimately take a different path. Julie had to face several hardships throughout her life: the separation of her parents, a physical ailment, the dissolution of her first marriage, but none of that ever seemed to stop her in her drive to live the way she wanted. In June of 1980, when she was 21, Julie attended a jazz concert in Portland where she met Mike Weflen. 2 years later, Julie moved to Washington State with Mike, and a year after that, they were married. According to friends and family, it was a happy marriage, and the two truly felt they belonged together. The couple purchased a home in Deer Park, just 30 minutes north of Spokane. Julie's love was as strong as ever. According to the Oregonian, Mike quit his hobbies of fishing and hunting for Julie as she couldn't bear to see animals harmed. In addition, the couple eventually purchased 2 horses. While Mike was working as a commercial house painter, Julie started taking steps towards her own career. She took an interest in working in the field of electric power and would endeavor through a 3-year apprenticeship, partially training in the area of Vancouver, becoming the only female operator working in the Upper Columbia region, according to the Spokesman Review. It wouldn't be easy, being the first through the wall never is, but Julie was as focused and determined as ever. If life had taught her anything, it was how to handle adversity, and she did it well, typically with a smile on her face. She eventually was hired on with BPA. It was a difficult job, but Julie loved it and appreciated the freedom it gave her. She frequently worked alone, did things at her own pace, and was in a way her own supervisor. Julie had an independent sense about her, always wanting to get the job done on her own. In an interview with the Spokesman Review, a coworker described Julie's work ethic, saying, quote, "She'd never ask for help, but any one of us would have gone out of our way to give Julie a hand." End quote. Perhaps her resistance to asking for help came out of her own drive, her own determination to get it done on her own, but it may also have had something to do with the culture in which she worked. At the time, it was a male-dominated field, so much so that Julie was the only female operator in the area. According to friends and family, the beginning of her career had been met with some resistance from the so-called boys' club, guys who had been working in the field for years who didn't see it as the kind of place a woman should work. Julie, though, was determined to follow her path, and no one was going to stand in her way. Reportedly, she dealt with a certain level of harassment from coworkers in those early days, but it never made her hesitate. She did her work, and she did it well. She broke all of the cliché tropes that were thrown at her, and she quickly became one of the most respected and hardest working people at BPA. Anyone who dared question her skill and drive was quickly dismissed, and while some coworkers have been open to her from day one, others came around. It wasn't long before Julie was considered one of their most skilled coworkers, and anyone who had tried to stand in her way was regarded as foolish for their preconceived notions. By the summer of 1987, things were still going strong at home. Julie's in-laws came to visit during the warmer months, and according to her mother-in-law, Phyllis, the couple was still living like an endless honeymoon. She later told the Spokesman Review, quote, They were as happy after 4.5 years of marriage as they were the day they got married. They were building a future together. End quote. Sadly, that future would be interrupted one cool Wednesday in the midst of September when Julie would vanish, leaving Mike and her family desperate for answers and, more importantly, for Julie's return. The morning of Wednesday, September 16th, was all set out to be a typical day for Julie and Mike. Julie would head out to BPA's Meade office to begin her day of work, while Mike was scheduled to paint a house in Ritzville, a small city 50 miles outside of Spokane. As per usual, Mike would call home shortly after 5 p.m. to chat with Julie and let her know when he expected to make it home, but on this evening, multiple calls from Mike would go unanswered. It wouldn't be until later that night that he would find out why. Not much is known about exactly what happened when Julie arrived at the Spring Hill substation northwest of Spokane. She had been dispatched to fix an issue with a transformer, something her coworkers have described as being a standard job, nothing out of the ordinary. According to the logbook at the unmanned station, Julie arrived at 2:30. Everything being ordinary, her work should have been completed in just over an hour. However, Julie never came back. She never radioed in. In fact, no one heard from Julie after she arrived at the substation, but there was also no indication that anything was wrong. Several hours later, at approximately 5 p.m., a resident living in the area drove past the substation. According to this resident, as he drove past, he noticed Julie's van parked in the gravel lot. The driver's side door was open, the rear hatch was up, and he could see a few items lying on the ground. At first, he didn't think much about it and continued along his way. Several hours later, though, this same resident passed through the area again, and once again the minivan was still sitting there. Nothing had changed. Considering how long it had been, the resident became concerned, and when he arrived at home, he picked up the phone and called the Spokane Sheriff's Office. A deputy was dispatched to the area to find out what was going on, but upon arriving at the scene, it seemed apparent that something had gone very wrong. The minivan was still there, but there was no sign of Julie. No one responded to repeated calls from the deputy, so he began moving towards the van, assuming that there could be an issue with the vehicle itself. Maybe the employee had walked off to get help, but what he found was concerning. The driver's side door was open, and inside was Julie's purse. Behind the van where the hatch was raised, the deputy found some items laying on the ground. Others were scattered in the area nearby and included Julie's hard hat, sunglasses, and a bottle of water. The gravel was disturbed near the van, and there was a fresh set of tire marks spinning out from skid marks, which indicated that someone else had driven onto the gravel and then sped off at a high rate of speed. It was later determined that those marks did not match Julie's van. Beyond the tire marks, the deputy noted what were clearly drag marks. That first deputy on the scene immediately radioed back describing what he was seeing and requested assistance. As the sun set and the night grew dark, a group of 12 sheriff's deputies and Washington State police officers converged on the scene and began the process of searching the area for any signs of Julie or any other evidence. Lieutenant John Goldman of the Spokane County Sheriff's Office later described the scene, saying, quote, "There is a definite sign of a struggle. There's indication she may have been taken out of the area." End quote. Investigators would later say that, based on the scene itself, it was their belief that Julie had been abducted and likely had been taken by more than one person. While the sheriff's office attempted to get in touch with Mike, a tracking dog was brought up to try and pick up any scents. The dog moved through the gravel parking lot, the area surrounding the substation, and then began expanding outward, going through the tall brush and weeds that surrounded the isolated area. Unfortunately, the dog was never able to pick up Julie's scent, which left investigators utilizing flashlights going through the fields and the banks of a nearby creek, but there were no signs of Julie. This initial search continued until dawn. Some have wondered why it had taken so long for anyone to notice Julie hadn't returned, but BPA later expressed that her direct supervisor was on vacation at the time, and this may have caused some confusion in terms of keeping track of where employees were. When investigators finally got in touch with Mike, they explained the situation they were facing. Julie hadn't been seen since early that afternoon, and there had been no indications of where she might have been, but the evidence suggested foul play. Detective Mac Henderson later told the Los Angeles Times, quote, "A couple of indentations in the gravel and a mark on the van where someone fell or was pushed against it is about all we have." End quote. Initially, police considered the possibility that Mike could have been involved in the disappearance of his wife, but he had a solid alibi. He had been more than 50 miles away at the time, and for anyone who doubted Mike's innocence, the dedication he would commit to trying to find his wife over the course of the investigation would quickly dismiss those doubts. Police dismissed him as a suspect after 1 week. While some investigators were searching, others were engaged in analyzing the evidence, specifically the tire tracks. It was believed at the time that someone had driven into the lot and parked near Julie's van, at which time a struggle had ensued between Julie and likely 2 abductors. Police theorized that Julie was overpowered and taken into the vehicle, at which time the driver sped out of the lot, heading east in the direction of the 7-mile bridge. The absence of blood at the scene left open the possibility that Julie might still be alive and not severely injured, though investigators were quick to express to reporters that time was of the essence, and the longer it took them to find her, the more likely it was that she could be harmed. As the sun began rising over the area, investigators made the decision to have the van towed back to the crime lab for examination, while other plans were put into place to expand their search for Thursday. Police set up a command post near the intersection of 7 Mile and Pine Bluff roads. In addition to the original 12 officers, 18 more were brought in along with 2 search helicopters and the assistance of a Red Cross truck. It was a frustrating area to search, as Lieutenant Norm Nickerson explained to the media, describing the situation as trying to find a needle in a haystack. In addition to law enforcement, the search party was joined by some of Julie's co-workers as well as Mike. Considering the possibility that it could likely be a kidnapping situation, the FBI was notified and they sent an agent out to the command post. FBI spokesman Joseph Smith later told the media, quote, "When you have somebody disappear under the circumstances that this one did, you have the potential that a federal kidnapping statute has been violated." End quote. As the number of police and civilian vehicles began growing in the area, residents who lived nearby found themselves stopping to ask what was happening. While this offered investigators the opportunity to interview multiple people who lived in and were familiar with the area, none of them were able to report anything substantial. For the most part, no one paid attention as they drove by the substation, and even if they did, it didn't appear that most people had actually seen Julie or her attackers. In total, the search for Julie would last for more than 48 hours before investigators officially called it off that weekend on Saturday the 19th. Authorities believed that they had done all they could do at the scene, but other than the van and the evidence surrounding it, they simply hadn't found anything to suggest who might have taken Julie or where she might have been taken. Sheriff's Lieutenant Earl Brown told the Spokesman Review, quote, "There's not much else we can do. We don't really know where to go from here, but I'm fairly sure we won't find anything in this area." End quote. In total, the Spokane County Sheriff's Office had utilized more than 75 deputies, BPA employees, volunteers, and members of search and rescue to cover an area of approximately 225 square miles of brush and dense forestry surrounding the substation, and they hadn't found a single scrap of evidence. Searchers had done a grid search on foot, a total of 3 helicopters had scoured the area, and other searchers had employed the use of horseback, but in the end, they simply came up blank. It appeared that Julie's abduction had taken place there in the parking lot, and there was no evidence in the surrounding area to be found. It wasn't completely useless, though. Canvassing of the residents living near the substation had resulted in a few helpful pieces of information, perhaps the most important one being related to a vehicle seen in the area that day, or, more accurately, 2 vehicles. At least one resident told authorities that he had seen a white sedan parked near the substation that day. However, as he approached, the white vehicle sped off at a high rate of speed. Whether or not this was related to Julie's abduction was uncertain, but as other residents later reported, they saw a brown van with Oregon plates, which was more likely to be the type of vehicle used for an abduction. Considering that Julie's ex-husband lived in Oregon, police began trying to track him down in an attempt to determine if he might have been involved. One particular witness told police that they saw Julie the day she vanished, shortly after 3 p.m., and ultimately authorities determined that Julie had likely been abducted at 3:30. While the official search had been called off, Mike wasn't anywhere close to giving up, and neither were friends and family. One of Julie's co-workers, Owen Berrio, put up $1,000 of his own money as a reward for her return, while also devoting countless hours to searching that area. He later told the Spokesman Review, quote, "As people go, she was a diamond. I can't think of any better use of my money if it will help in some way to get her back safely." End quote. Julie's employer, BPA, spoke with the media and discussed plans to ensure security for lone workers operating at isolated substations in the future. They also expressed their hope for Julie's safe return, saying that they were not seeking a replacement for her at that time because they believe she would return. In her absence, multiple employees took on overtime to help cover Julie's shifts. Mike was determined to find Julie and continued searching the area with the help of friends and family. In addition, he posted a $10,000 reward for his wife's safe return, telling the media, quote, "We aren't looking for a conviction, just Julie. I have no intention of leaving this area until I find her." End quote. Mike had a group of approximately 80 volunteers assisting in his search, some who had worked with Julie, some who didn't know him or Julie at all, but simply wanted to be there to do what they could to try and help narrow down anything in that area. That Saturday morning, they gathered and operated a grid search, expanding out further than police had. In addition to searching the fields and forests, they were going door to door asking questions and showing photos of Julie. Despite these efforts, they weren't able to find anything investigators could have missed. Within days of the original search, friends and family pooled together $20,000 to offer as a reward. BPA matched that, bringing the official reward to $40,000. In addition to the rewards, there was also a full blitz in the media, with local news covering the story extensively. Thousands of missing persons flyers were printed up, and by the end of that first weekend, more than 5,000 had been distributed in the area, posted up in town, and shown in newspapers and on local news. Slowly, the search for Julie began devolving, and volunteers were soon asked to distribute flyers rather than continuing to crawl through the brush in wooded areas. BPA employees who had been assisting in the search returned to work at the beginning of the next week, though a handful took paid time off to continue helping. Mike made a plea to local landowners to take the time to search through their property and to see if they could find anything significant, but it doesn't appear that anything was ever found related to Julie. The Spokane Sheriff's Office was inundated with calls from locals to report sightings of Julie. Some people believe they saw her waiting for a bus downtown. Others claimed to have seen her camping out in the park near to where she had vanished, but ultimately, the leads which were given were tracked down and dismissed as cases of mistaken identity. The wide array of media coverage had put people in the mindset to keep their eyes peeled, which was good, but Julie's description could fit a large chunk of the female population, and while callers were considered as trying to help, many of their leads were dead ends which used up valuable time. Sergeant B.C. Schultz later spoke to the media, expressing the dismal outlook, saying, quote, "Nothing has panned out. We have followed every legitimate tip called in, but common sense seems to dictate we're simply not going to find her." End quote. Detective Jim Hansen expressed frustration, explaining that while the media coverage was good, it also caused a lot of people to come out of the woodwork with tips that just led them on wild goose chases. While initially investigators had considered Julie's ex-husband as a potential suspect, they managed to track him down early on. As it turned out, on the day in question, he had been in the city of Auburn, approximately 300 miles to the west. When his alibi checked out and it was confirmed he hadn't had the time or the opportunity to abduct Julie, let alone the motive, police were quick to rule him out. This set them back to square one, in a sense, as they now had no particular person of interest to examine, though one would soon make himself apparent. The first few weeks of the search and investigation was tough on both police and Julie's family. For authorities, they had few leads to work with and little evidence recovered at the scene. They had enough to know this was a crime, that Julie had been taken against her will, but beyond that, the possibilities were endless. The more time passed, the more dangerous the situation became. Sergeant Schultz explained, quote, "The longer we go without finding her, the more likely it is she's been killed. There's always the possibility she's being held somewhere, though, and that is what keeps us looking." End quote. In early October, approximately 2 weeks after Julie's disappearance, divers from search and rescue went into the waters of nearby Long Lake, though nothing would be discovered. Mike was struggling to keep his life together. After Julie's disappearance, he had spent all of his free time searching, and when it came time to rest, he simply couldn't bring himself to go home, saying, quote, "I just don't know how to explain it. Without her there, it's impossible for me to stay. I don't know when I'll be able to go back, but hopefully it will be with Julie." End quote. That was the home that they had built together, and it just didn't feel right for Mike to be there without her. He wouldn't return home for 3 weeks. A month after her disappearance, the Spokesman Review caught up with him, still searching near the substation. He explained, quote, "I have to come here. I guess I'm drawn to it." End quote. He had done a lot in a month's time. More than 17,000 missing persons flyers had been distributed across 5 surrounding states as well as parts of Canada. Sheriff's offices in 11 surrounding counties had received the flyers, and every street corner was plastered with images of Julie. Unfortunately, though, none of the calls coming in were helping investigators get any closer to finding her. By November, most people were losing hope, but the searches continued. A vigil was held to both honor and bring attention to Julie, while local businesses donated prizes for a benefit, all proceeds going towards future searches and production of flyers. BPA chipped in, agreeing to print 200,000 flyers which were to be distributed around the country. Buttons bearing Julie's image were produced and distributed throughout Washington and surrounding states. It was important to Mike and Julie's family to keep her name and face out there, to keep people focused on looking for her. 75 billboards were erected in Washington and Oregon, hoping to bring more attention. While they were doing their best to find the 28-year-old, investigators began taking a look at someone who they officially began considering a person of interest. There isn't a lot of information publicly available about that person. In fact, police have never had enough evidence to say his name, but some details have been released over time. According to an article in the Spokesman Review, the man was brought to the attention of investigators in December of '87, 3 months after Julie vanished. Sheriff's deputies visited the man, interviewing him twice, but Lieutenant John Goldman explained, quote, "He has not been cooperative. We have not been able to eliminate him." End quote. Reportedly, the man lived in the area near the substation, and in addition to that, he was an acquaintance of Debbie Swanson, a school teacher who had disappeared a year earlier. For investigators, that was a little too curious to be a coincidence. While at the time it was not made public, this suspect eventually told police only to contact him through his lawyer, and later, after agreeing to take a polygraph test, he failed, with police noting that he showed signs of deception. Unfortunately, despite their interest, they had no solid evidence to make a connection. By the end of the year, police expressed that they had spoken with and eliminated 4 potential persons of interest, 2 of which were Mike and Julie's ex-husband. The one man who police had not ruled out stayed on their radar, but due to communicating through his lawyer and an absence of evidence, they had no ability to force the man to speak with them, and he had long since decided he didn't wish to cooperate, later telling the Spokesman Review that he believed police were harassing him and planning to frame him. For their part, BPA kept Julie's desk exactly as it was for a year. In September of 1988, Julie was officially removed from the BPA payroll files and her desk was cleared out. Mike had finally been able to return to the home the couple had shared, but it was never the same, and he found himself leaving things exactly as Julie had. Slowly, his life became living in a museum in remembrance of her life, one which he was afraid to disrupt. Mike tried to remain positive, but the passage of a year had darkened his outlook. He later told the press, quote, "I can't get myself to go on without knowing one way or the other where she is, but until I know, I'll never let go of just a little bit of hope." End quote. Soon, days began turning to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years. It was a difficult and bitter pill to swallow to watch the investigation grow steadily colder every day. Throughout much of the 90s, there were occasional mentions of Julie in the media. Mostly when an unidentified body was found in the area, speculation would rise up, but in each case, it always turned out to be someone else. 20 years would pass before police addressed another person of interest. In a 2007 interview with the Spokesman Review, Detective Doug Marsk explained that their previous person of interest, the man who had failed his polygraph, had been brought back to their attention by a recent phone call. The suspect had died years earlier, but police were reinvestigating the possibility of his involvement, as well as the role he could have played in the disappearance of 2 other women. Deborah Swanson disappeared from nearby Idaho, approximately 30 miles to the east of Spokane, a year and a half prior to Julie. Swanson, who had been a special education teacher, disappeared from a trail she jogged on. Swanson had been an acquaintance of the person of interest, and authorities noted the similarities between the cases. Both women had vanished in broad daylight, both had left behind personal items at their vehicles, and neither had ever been found. A few months after Swanson's disappearance in May of '86, 21-year-old Sally Stone mysteriously vanished from the same area. She was last seen leaving the office of a physical therapist who she was seeing due to a knee injury. Much like in Julie and Swanson's cases, there was no solid evidence as to what exactly happened, but authorities believe she had likely been the victim of an abduction. Her car was found parked outside of her home with a stale box of donuts still sitting on the passenger seat. Her home didn't appear to be missing anything other than her purse and the clothes she had been wearing. To this day, these 3 disappearances remain unsolved, and whether or not there is truly a link between them is unknown. While it had been a long and painful struggle for him, Mike eventually had to move on with his life. He moved, married, became a father. However, Julie still remained present in his mind, and in 2007 he addressed those painful memories, saying, quote, "If I could do anything to resolve it, I would. After 20 years, you come to the realization you're probably not going to know what happened in your lifetime." End quote. Sadly, that was true for Julie's mother, who passed away in 2006. She never found out the truth of what became of her, nor did she ever have the ability to lay her to rest. In 2011, nearly 25 years after Julie was last seen, a former BPA employee named John Polos decided it was time to reinvigorate that investigation. Gathering up several retired BPA employees, he visited the scene of the crime and embarked on his own investigation. During this time, when discussing the case with investigators, Polos learned that police had never searched Julie's locker at work. In fact, for all those years, it had remained sealed shut with the padlock that only Julie held the key for. Finally, that padlock was cut off, and several items were removed by investigators, though they would not comment on the contents as they didn't want to harm the investigation, according to the Oregonian. Through his own investigation, Polos came across more than 50 women who had disappeared in the area between Julie and Swanson and Stone over the last 40 years. While some believed there was the possibility that the women had been victims of a serial killer, authorities were quick to note they had ruled out both Robert Lee Yates Jr., the so-called Spokane Killer, and Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Whether or not a yet unidentified serial killer was operating in the area at the time, or if there are any distinct connections between any of those disappearances, remains unconfirmed. However, through his initial investigation, Polos was able to supply authorities with a list of local names to investigate, though police later said nothing major had developed from his tips. In 2012, police submitted evidence they had gathered during their investigation to a lab for DNA analysis. The hope was that advancements in technology could help them develop something which could establish a link between Julie and their person of interest, or perhaps help rule him out. Detective Mike Ricketts told the Spokesman Review that the hope was that the analysis would be able to, quote, confirm it's the person we think or come back and say, no, it's not, end quote. Any developments or new information which may have been gained from the lab analysis has never been made public, and in the past decade there have been few, if any, developments in the disappearance or abduction of Julie Weflen. Over the years, there has been one key point of debate amongst investigators. Was Julie specifically targeted, or was this a crime of opportunity? Lieutenant Steve Barbieri discussed the possibilities, arguing that while a crime of opportunity committed by someone living in the area was possible, it seemed more probable that the abductor may have seen Julie elsewhere and followed her out to the substation, commenting that abductions, quote, aren't usually spontaneous decisions, end quote. It was later noted that the Spring Hill substation was not on Julie's regular schedule for that day, so it's not believed anyone could have been lurking at the station waiting for her arrival. When last seen, Julie Ann Weflen was described as being a Caucasian female with brown hair and brown eyes, standing 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing approximately 100 pounds. Julie has a scar on her back, a steel rod implanted in her spine, and her ears were pierced. While no description of her clothing has ever been made available, it is known that she was wearing a black Casio brand watch and a gold wedding ring set with diamonds. Julie was last seen at the Spring Hill substation northwest of Spokane on September 16, 1987. Julie Weflen mysteriously vanished while performing a routine task for her job. All evidence seems to indicate that someone, or a group of people, abducted the 28-year-old from just outside of her work van. For more than 30 years, friends, family, and investigators have tried to determine what happened to Julie, where she could be, and who may be responsible. While no remains have ever been found, Julie's case has changed from being listed as a missing person to being a probable homicide. All these years later, there are still those who seek the truth, who continue to hunt for Julie, and who hope to someday find those answers. A $25,000 reward is still in place, offered by BPA. However, over the course of the past 8 years, there have been few, if any, developments, and the only thing police know for certain is that someone out there knows exactly what happened to Julie Weflen. The disappearance of Julie Weflen is a truly disturbing and mystifying case. A woman goes to an isolated power station to complete routine maintenance and never comes back. At the scene, police find obvious signs of a struggle and what they believe indicates an abduction. However, by the time they were notified and began their search, nearly 6 hours had passed, giving whoever had been involved a large head start in covering their tracks. There's no main suspect from the get-go, but over the years, police are able to narrow their search down to one man. They simply lack the evidence to make any formal charges. After all these years, there is no absolute certainty about that individual's guilt, and so the possibilities remain open as to who may have been involved. Ultimately, though, there's really only a finite amount of theories which have ever been given legitimate consideration. These theories tend to follow one of two separate branches. Either the crime was committed at random, or at least partially at random, or Julie may have been targeted by someone else. There's certainly information available which lends support to one side or the other. We'll begin with the theory that this was a planned abduction and work our way towards the other options. According to everything we know and the investigation which was conducted, police were unable to find anyone in Julie's personal life, past or present, who they considered a likely possibility. There was no one who seemed to hold a major grudge or who had issues with Julie in the weeks and months leading up to her disappearance. As is the case in most situations, investigators began by looking at both Mike and Julie's ex-husband, but both men had solid alibis. Mike was painting a home an hour away, and the ex-husband was hundreds of miles away in a different part of the state. Clearly, neither of these men were directly involved, and I think over the years Mike made his devotion to finding Julie quite apparent. But there is one piece of information which does tend to raise the eyebrows of some who examine this case. Is it merely coincidence that a van with Oregon plates was spotted in the vicinity the day Julie vanished? If you'll recall, she's originally from Portland. There isn't a ton of public information available about Julie's background, but neither family or investigators have ever made the suggestion that someone Julie knew during her time in Portland may have been involved. Many, though, find that it's far too coincidental to just be dismissed out of hand that Oregon plates were seen in the area that day. Now, if the plates had been seen on a car, I'd probably be quick to assume it could have been a rental or just a traveler, but I think the key, which is fascinating, is that it's a van. How often have you walked through a parking lot at night and seen one of those big windowless vans? Around here, people jokingly refer to them as kidnapper vans, but there could also be another explanation. Julie disappeared not far from Riverside State Park, and it's generally been considered possible the van could simply have been someone who had gone to the park, either for camping, fishing, or some other activity. It easily could have been someone simply passing through the area, or maybe someone like Julie who had moved to the area but hadn't yet fully transferred over their license plate to switch out to a Washington one. There is also, of course, the possibility that the witness who noted seeing the van was simply mistaken. However, I do find this piece of information fascinating. It opens up the door to the possibility that someone from Julie's past could have been involved. But I suppose the question comes down to how that person would have known where Julie was that day. The work she was doing up at the substation that afternoon wasn't on her daily schedule. It was something that came up during the course of a regular workday, and she made the choice to go out there and fix it. The only way someone from Portland could have known where she was that day would have been if that person was following her, stalking her, and while that is certainly not something that can be ruled out, police have never found anyone they consider a person of interest from Julie's past. That doesn't mean there can't be one, simply that if there is, that person did a really good job of covering their tracks. You imagine when they dug into Julie's past, they'd have cross-referenced anyone they came across with DMV records to check for ownership of a brown van, and according to everything I've read, they never found a match on that. However, a planned abduction doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be someone that Julie knew. Someone could have seen her at any given time, maybe even just that day, and decided that she was their target. While some abductors and killers plan their victims out in advance, researching and tracking them, others operate more on a spur-of-the-moment situation of opportunity. It isn't difficult to imagine someone could have seen Julie that day, decided to follow her, or maybe had already been following her for some time, and her arrival at the substation provided them with exactly the type of opportunity they were looking for. Of course, if this was planned, you have to wonder why this particular day. Julie frequently went to substations for work or was out working on lines in isolated areas. She worked alone, that's the way she preferred it, and unfortunately that opened the door to a lot of possibilities when it comes to someone abducting her. No witnesses actually saw the abduction take place, though 2 vehicles were noted as being in the area, the brown van and a white sedan. In fact, the white sedan was noted as being parked nearby and then speeding off when another driver approached. That certainly sounds a bit suspicious, but we have to consider all possibilities. Was the driver involved in abducting Julie, or was he looking for an isolated spot to do something else and got scared away? That's hard to say. We know that Julie had faced some backlash at the beginning of her career, a lot of guys not wanting to deal with the new woman on the job, so it's not out of the question to imagine there could have been some disdain existing from someone she worked with. While times had changed, and generally all the employees had said Julie was a hard worker who they respected, it also seems unlikely an employee who had a grudge against her was going to bring that up in an interview following her disappearance. While no one could generally have an idea of where Julie was going to be that day, someone she worked with certainly could have found out. I suppose the question could become, could someone at work be angry enough or jealous enough or whatever enough with Julie to want to harm her? Well, unfortunately, people have been killed for far less. Police investigated Julie's coworkers, though, and none of them has ever been considered a person of interest as far as we know. Many of them dedicated time and money to trying to find her, to trying to help the investigation. There hasn't been a lot of discussion about this angle, and maybe that's because there isn't anything to it, but I do think it's something that's interesting to look at. When you're blazing a new trail, when you're the only woman operator working in the entire area, there's a good chance someone's going to resent that because sadly we live in a world that has assholes like that in it. I don't know if there's any connection between a coworker or former coworker of Julie's, but it's certainly a possibility which cannot be simply dismissed out of hand. A coworker would know that isolated location. They'd be able to pull up without scaring Julie off, and they'd likely be able to get close enough to grab her before she realized what was happening. Then again, she could have just been caught completely off guard. So that brings us to the other side of the theories, the idea that this was more random, in a manner of speaking. Maybe not so much random in that someone was out looking to grab a woman in the middle of nowhere and just happened upon Julie, but maybe a local who was familiar enough to know that that substation was unmanned and Julie was likely there by herself. Julie wasn't a large woman, 5'2", 100 pounds. Depending on the abductor, he may have viewed her as an easy target, but we also have to keep in mind that the detail police suggested said that this was more than likely done by more than one person. Everyone who knew Julie argued that she was a fighter and she would have fought hard against someone trying to abduct her. Evidence at the scene suggests that at some point, someone was pressed against or thrown against her work van. Drag marks might signify that at some point, Julie was either knocked unconscious or incapacitated to the point that the abductor was able to drag her to a vehicle. That's kind of a detail which throws me off, though. You'd imagine if two people were present, you wouldn't have drag marks, because one would grab her arms while the other grabbed her legs, and they'd carry her. But maybe things happened rapidly and the abductors were sloppy. Sure, they managed to get away with Julie without leaving any major evidence behind, but that may be more a case of luck rather than intelligent planning. It's a pretty brazen abduction. Sure, the substation is isolated and somewhat desolate, but there's a busy state park just up the road and people living in the area. If nothing else, this abduction had to have happened extremely quickly. I've often considered the possibility that a van could have pulled up next to Julie, and while the driver distracted her for a second, another person could have whipped open the side door or the back doors, grabbed Julie and dragged her in. Before she even knew what was happening, she could have been in the van and it was driving off. It's a disturbing scenario to imagine, but a probable one that unfortunately happens more often than we'd like to admit. Now, we know there's been a person of interest in this case since nearly the beginning. This person of interest lived nearby, failed a polygraph, and refused to cooperate with investigators. This person of interest also had a connection to Deborah Swanson, one of the women who had disappeared from Idaho some 30 miles away a year earlier. How likely is it that someone's going to be connected to a missing woman while simultaneously living close to the location from which another woman was abducted? I'm sure it's not astronomical, but it's enough that it drew law enforcement's interest and has maintained that interest since 1987. Being that we don't know a ton about the person of interest, it's difficult to have too in-depth of a conversation about him. However, I for one don't put a lot of stock into polygraphs, so him showing deception doesn't necessarily pique my interests. I do find it interesting, though, that he agreed to take a polygraph in the first place, lawyered up, and then refused to speak to police about the case again. In one particular article I read, it said that he told police he had never heard of Julie or her disappearance before they spoke with him. But later in the same conversation, he noted that he had been driving by the scene of the search for Julie and pointed it out to his girlfriend. So, did he know before they talked to him or not? Beyond that, I don't know exactly what information police are working with, but whatever it is has been enough for them to stay focused on this guy for over 30 years, even after he's dead. There's a lot of smoke there, but there's some fire too. So, could it have simply been a matter of someone who lived nearby coming through at just the right moment, seeing Julie and then attacking? No one could have been sitting there waiting for her, as no one knew she was going to be there that day, so if she wasn't followed and if it wasn't planned, then random is the only option you're left with. It seems completely bizarre, it seems highly unlikely, but oftentimes those incredibly random crimes are the ones which are the most difficult to solve. There's no trail to follow because there was never a trail. It was a crime of opportunity, a decision made off the cuff. While that seems unlikely, there have been a lot of abductions that have happened in just that way. There are a lot of women who went missing in the years surrounding Julie. Some of them vanished in similar fashions, leaving behind few clues and seemingly having been abducted not far from their own vehicles. Deborah Swanson and Sally Stone are two examples, two which seem to share a great deal of similarities with Julie. All three were smaller-sized women, though Julie and Deborah were the only two who disappeared from remote areas as far as we know. I think there's certainly a chance a serial killer was following a protocol in that area, one which had worked in the past, and so it was executed again and again. By the time Julie came along, this person may have been so set in their ways and comfortable with their methods that a broad daylight abduction wasn't all that concerning. If so, the answer to Julie's disappearance, as well as many other women's, may still be out there somewhere with the person responsible. That particular area has a state park, a lot of wooded areas, and a long stretch of road that cuts through some desolate and unpopulated areas. For a serial killer, if indeed abduction and murder was the target, there's a lot of places someone could be disposed of where they'll never be found. The park itself is going to offer vast swaths of wooded areas and fields, places not often traveled, trails that few take. It isn't difficult to imagine that there could be a lot of answers buried in the mountains somewhere, or perhaps at the bottom of a canyon. Unfortunately, in more than 30 years since Julie vanished, no one has ever found anything. No scrap of clothing, no fragment of bone, nothing to suggest where Julie may have gone. It's certainly not outside the realm of possibility that a methodical killer could have been responsible. So what do you think? Was Julie targeted by someone? Maybe someone she knew, maybe someone who had become interested in her but she didn't know. Could an angry coworker have plotted this or viewed it as an opportunity and decided it was the right time to take out their anger? Was there a yet unidentified serial killer operating in that area? Or was it someone local? Someone who saw Julie and decided against all odds that he or they were going to grab her and disappear. In many, many cold cases that are eventually solved, the person responsible is frequently found in investigators' notes from early on. To me, the fact that police focused on a local with ties to another missing person and remained focused on him today says a lot about what likely happened that afternoon. Unfortunately, without further evidence, a break in the case, or a direct confession, the disappearance of Julie Weflen will remain open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information about the disappearance of Julie Weflen, the Spokesman Review has an extensive catalog of articles, and there are many forums discussing this case. Unsolved Mysteries touched on Julie's story, and Anne Rule dedicated a chapter to the case in her book, Kiss Me, Kill Me. If you have any information about the disappearance of Julie Weflen, please contact the Spokane County Sheriff's Office at 509-625-4005. The agency case number is 87-60135. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, message me on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, or comment in the Facebook group. I'd like to take a moment now to thank our amazing Patreon producers: Alicia Lorraine, Brittany Bivens, Christine Greco, Krista Colvin, D'Earthy, Diane Dyson, Eamon Brady, Jason Yeager, Jennifer Winkler, Kate Much, Kevin Bonham, Megan Cotter, Michael Draves, Nick Mohar Schurz, Pamela Coburn, Quinn McBreen, Roberta Jansen, Sarah Mascaratolo, Travis Skepsko, Stephanie Joy, Tom Archer, and Tracy Woods. You're all amazing, and your contributions are greatly appreciated, as are all patrons. If you're interested in supporting Trace Evidence, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence or visit trace-evidence.com for further information. I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.